So building a home to awaken, equip, and send. So my teaching text today is John chapter number 6. John chapter 6. So if you brought your Bible, I hope you did. Just open it up to John chapter 6. If you didn't, all of this passage is going to be on the screen. I want you to pay attention to the dialogue between Jesus and his disciples in this passage I'm going to read. It's a popular story, even if maybe it's been a while since you've read it, or maybe you've never even cracked a Bible before. You will probably have heard something about this story. It's pretty well known. But I want to pull some lessons from it that I think the Lord has for you and I today. So John chapter 6, we're going to read the first 13 verses. After this, Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee, or Tiberias. A huge crowd was following him because they saw the signs that he was performing by healing the sick. Jesus went up a mountain and sat down there with his disciples. I'll come back to that. Verse 4, now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. Can I just give you a little tip on your Bible reading? If you ever hear a biblical writer use a phrase or a name or a festival, and then he gives a little insight into it, that's a little clue into who he's writing to, okay? So in your own Bible reading, this is a freebie. This is not part of my message today. Now the Passover, a Jewish festival. If he has to describe that it's a Jewish festival, he's probably not writing to Jews. Does that make sense? He's writing to Gentiles. So you can keep those things in mind in your own Bible reading. Verse 4, now the Passover, a Jewish festival, was near. So when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, one of his disciples, where will we buy bread so that these people can eat? Jesus asked this to test Philip, for Jesus himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread wouldn't be enough for each of them to have a little. That's about 8 months' wages. One of Jesus's other disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, so they sat down. The men numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, and after giving thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. Don't you love that? When they were full, he told his disciples, collect the leftovers so that nothing is wasted. So they collected them and filled 12 baskets. How many disciples were there? 12 baskets with the pieces from the 5 barley loaves that were left over by those who had eaten. So Jesus has led his disciples into a situation where the needs around them are greater than their ability to meet the needs. And John is quite clear about the reason why. One of the reasons why. It was because Jesus wanted to test them. I had a conversation with Frank Green a couple months ago. If you've yet to meet Frank, he is our local scholar and theologian. And he was giving me insight into this principle on testing. And Frank asked me, he said, so why would Jesus test somebody when he already knows how they're going to answer the test? And I was like, this is a good question you ask me, Frank. Why don't you tell me the answer? And Frank told me, he said, Jesus was testing his disciples so they would have a revelation of their own condition. Jesus didn't need to know what they would do about the test. They needed to know what they would do about the test. And through the test, they discovered their perspective on who God is, how much they trusted him, and how much compassion they had for the people they were ministering to. One of the first signs you know that you're in a test is when you try to educate God about the test you're in. Jesus comes up to Philip and poses a question to him. And Philip, can you hear the tone? I don't know, maybe it's just me. I add vibes to the text. Philip just sounds sassy, right? Jesus. 8 months of wages couldn't feed all these people. Just in case you didn't know that. And Andrew, I don't know if it was out of compassion for his friend Philip, or he just knew this is heading south fast. Andrew hops in, and although we don't really know his faith level, he gives Jesus a little something. Well, Jesus, there's a boy here with a meal. And God is like, when he tests us, he's like, so how do you think you're going to get through this? Well, God, this is a good question, because based on my past experience, based on my current understanding, I'm not really sure. But all along, God knows what he is about to do. And I can't help but think about our own situations. Maybe you're trying to figure out how you're going to get through uni. God's like, how are you going to do this? And you're like, I have no idea. I don't know how I made it through GCSEs and A-levels. There's going to be 2 lifetimes worth of tutoring and maybe some teacher bribery somewhere in this. And God is asking you to test you, because all along he knows what he's going to do. Maybe you're new to faith and God's asking you today, how are you going to get to know me? And well, God, I'm the only person with faith in my family. I have no examples or mentors. But God is asking this to test you because he himself knows what he's going to do. Maybe you feel the question, how are you going to have a healthy marriage? Well, God, in light of my broken past, my traumatic upbringing, it would take more therapy than I can afford. And God asked this to test her, for he knew himself what he was going to do. Ramp Church, where are you going to house a multi-generational, sweeping movement of righteousness, justice, and peace in the vibrant knowledge of God? Well, God, a high school isn't big enough. It'll take stadiums to hold that. Where are we going to get one of those? And God asked this to test them, for he himself knew what he was going to do. So the test isn't for God to learn. It's for you and I to know our true condition. And it's not just so we can learn our true condition. God is leading us into a growing of our faith. And he's leading us into a faith that works. Do you know your faith is meant to work? This is what we see in the story. We see a faith that multiplies things. I'm reminded of a story I heard a few years back about a couple who was not in church, not in a relationship with God, not a people of faith. And the wife in the couple started just getting a desire about faith, a desire to learn more about God. So she started attending church and eventually became a follower of Jesus. And she started praying. She started her own personal prayer time, and her husband, being the encourager that he was, started to poke fun at her for this. And as she started to describe the things that she's praying about, he started to take note of them because he was wanting to, over time, prove to her how silly and foolish her new superstition is. But what he discovered was that over time, as he started to track the things she was praying for, a healing turnaround in her cousin and a shift in the relationship with her workmate, that these things coincidentally started to work in the positive. And what ended up happening was, because he noticed a faith that worked, he eventually got interested in God himself and became a follower of Jesus. Isn't it amazing that the more you pray, the more coincidences happen? See, God is leading you and I into a faith that has results. A faith that works. And this is what Jesus was doing in John 6. He was investing into them that their faith grew to the place that it could multiply to meet needs beyond their own self. Are you ready, Ramp Church, to be on a growth path in your own faith? Well, today I want to talk about 3 growth steps to faith that works. 3 growth steps to faith that works. Growth step number 1. Move closer to Jesus and others. Move closer to Jesus and others. Notice that in the story, a huge crowd had gathered around Jesus, but it was his disciples that sat down with him. In fact, this was part of Jesus' initial call all along. In Mark 3:14, it says this, "And Jesus appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him. And then he might send them out to preach." But he appointed them first to be with them. And this leads us to our first growth step. Move closer to Jesus and others. Because faith's first work isn't about getting stuff, it's about getting God. Faith's first work isn't about getting stuff, it's about getting God. Faith opens your eyes to see who Jesus really is. It's the birthplace of a new life of drawing near to God. The writer of Hebrews says it like this in Hebrews 10:22. "Let us draw near to God with a sincere heart," I love this, "and with the full assurance that faith brings." Faith brings full assurance. Why? Because faith tells me as I draw near, I will be embraced. I'll be accepted because now faith has given me eyes to see Jesus. Whereas before I was trepidatious, or maybe I was angry, I was bitter at God. Now faith has awakened my sight to not just be a crowd who's in earshot of Jesus, but to be a disciple who sits down with him. They both heard the message, but only one was involved in the miracle. You see, this idea, it messes with some of us in our vision of faith because many of us view faith as a tool to get the life that I've always dreamed of. Faith becomes practical. And even when I gave the title of this message, "A Faith That Works," we're like, oh, this is perfect. This is what I need. Because I have a lot of things that I have need of in life, and if faith can help me get those, awesome. But faith is not a tool to manifest my will. Faith's first work is that I can draw near to God. Christian faith isn't simply a tool to help me in life, it's deeper than that. This is a big idea. Are you ready? Say, I'm ready. Faith is more like the reorienting of my life around a whole new center point. Faith is the revelation of who God is and the invitation to shape my life around that reality. Okay, Joe, you're making me nervous. This is bigger than I thought. Yes, but it also assumes that each of us already realizes that our life is already shaped around something. You are already formed around what's most important to you. So the debate is not, I have no center and now I'm receiving a center. It is, I now have revelation of what's most valuable and I'm centering my life around that. The question is, how does your current center point compare to God? And if you're exploring faith today, this is a question you need to wrestle with. If you've never challenged your own center point, then you are living based on a center point that you adopted. It's just been unexamined. It was given to you by your parents, the culture around you, your boss, your heroes. But you've absorbed it from something. And if it's been unexamined and unchallenged, I would encourage you to examine it and challenge it. And then what you find there, compare its worth, its value, its strength, and its transcendence to God himself. So when you simply add faith to your life, it's kind of like installing an app on your phone. The new app may promise the world, but it's still limited by the functionality of the device. But this is not Christian faith. Christian faith is a whole new device. The invitation of Christian faith is to be unified with Christ's death and his resurrection through faith and practice. And in that, you're given access to a whole new humanity. More accurately, true humanity. Our true selves are filled and made alive with God's breath and power. The philosopher and theologian James K. Smith, he shows the need for this deeper transformation like this. He says this, the question isn't whether you're going to believe, but who. It's not merely about what to believe, but who to entrust yourself to. Do we really think humanity is our best bet? Do we really think we're the answer to our own problems, we who've generated all of them? The problem with everything from Enlightenment scientism to mushy eat, pray, loveism is us. If anything looks irrational, it's the notion that we are our own best hope. What is he pointing to? He's pointing to the fact that even if faith could be used as a tool to add on to your life, it wouldn't fix much anyway. Because what you and I actually need is a new center point. It's not a demand from God. It's an invitation. This is why free will is beautiful and God honors it. Because you can choose to remain your own center point. But James K. Smith's point is, you won't end up where you're wanting to go anyway. The only center point that lasts through everything life throws at you is what Christian hope provides. Christian hope is that when you embrace the reality that God, determined to mend the very fabric of humanity, chose to enter the human story as the person of Jesus, to become part of that fabric himself, to be broken and torn like every other human being, and then ultimately to claim victory over human brokenness through his own resurrection. So that you and I, through union with him, can find wholeness. You trade your brokenness and you receive his wholeness. That's the promise of the gospel. If you've never said yes to him, today's a good day. Faith isn't an add-on. It's not a life hack. It's moving closer to Jesus and others. But the thing about moving closer to Jesus is you don't just get closer to him in a relational sense, but you start to see things the way he does. It's not an accident that the writer John mentioned that Jesus and the disciples went up a mountain. John wasn't simply explaining the geography so you could picture it as you're reading it. He was highlighting that Jesus was inviting his followers to share his vantage point, his perspective. And this leads to the second growth step number 2, the renewing of your mind. The journey of growth in faith is not simply about getting closer to Jesus and others. It is also about a mind renewal. The reason our first point matters is that a mind unrenewed by faith in Jesus is weighed down by how questions. How are we going to feed all these people? How can I get the money needed? How will people respond? But a renewed mind is always anchored in the ultimate who question. Who am I relying on? We know that Jesus was leading them to mind renewal because in Matthew's account, another gospel writer, of the disciples' journey with Jesus, Matthew records a beautiful interaction that comes down the line after this food multiplying story, and it's in Matthew 16, verses 7 through 10. The disciples were discussing among themselves, we didn't bring any bread. Aware of this, Jesus said, you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves that you do not have bread? Don't you understand yet? Hasn't your mind been renewed yet? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you collected? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many large baskets you collected? When Stacy and I, in one of our house moves, out of obedience to the Lord, we were moving house, and there were so many, I think, anxieties around this house move for us, and for many reasons that I don't have time to go into. But in prayer one day about this, I say prayer like that's a really holy stance. Most of the time, it was more like desperation and complaining, okay? So don't get this wrong image of me. So I'm in prayer, and I'm just like, Lord, what do you have us going through right now? Why are we doing this? And I felt from the Lord that there was something about the postcode of our new house that had a message. Now, if you know me, that's not how I generally think. I don't roll that way, okay? I'm weirded out by some of that stuff. And I think the Lord likes to play with me by pointing things like this out. So I'm like, okay, first of all, Lord, if that's you, that's weird. Number 2, that's probably not you. But I'll give it a shot. Okay, what's the postcode? So I look up the postcode, and the postcode was M16 9PR. That was our postcode. And I immediately knew this is Matthew 16. But I didn't know what the verse was. So I turned to Matthew 16, and verse 9 says this, don't you understand yet? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you collected? What was God saying to me? This is what he was saying. It's this principle. The most valuable result of your miracle isn't a met need. It's a renewed mind. A miracle from God, when God intervenes in your story, it's not simply to meet your temporary need. He's trying to teach you something new about who he is and who you are. That's the eternal result of the miracle. That's the most valuable thing about the miracle. And the disciples are here after they had seen him do the miraculous with bread and fish, and they're wondering, who forgot the bread? They're arguing Jesus is upset because someone forgot the bread. And Jesus overhears them and says, do you not understand yet? You're receiving my miracles, but you're not learning from my miracles. They're reaching your hands, but they're not reaching your hearts. This is one of the dangers if you've been in church for a long time. Maybe you're a young person and you've grown up in church. Is you've experienced miracles in your hands, but if you don't hang around and stare at them long enough, they don't yet get in your heart. Because God's not simply after a mental ascension that miracles are possible. What he wants is that the realization that miracles are possible tell you something about his nature and his character, his intentions towards you, and how much he can be trusted that you didn't know until you saw the miracle. The most valuable thing about your miracle isn't a met need. It's a renewed mind. This display up here has gone out, guys, if you can help me with that. The crowd had their needs met. The disciples had their minds renewed about who Jesus is and how they're meant to live. The beautiful thing about this is a renewed mind empowers you to steward mystery in your life. You see, Christian and non-Christian alike, your life will include things you just can't understand. Can I get a witness? And Christians who view their faith as a tool struggle with mystery. Because their expectation is that their faith gives them answers to life's greatest problems. And on one level, I can go there. I'm a Christian not just because I've encountered God, I feel like I've met God, but because it makes the most sense of the world to me. It's the most compelling worldview there is. But everyone's life will bring them to a level of suffering and hardship that shakes them to the core. And if you're young enough not to have experienced that yet, just wait a few years. And if your idea of faith insists that you're able to make sense of your suffering, the odds aren't great of you making it out with your faith intact. But when your faith has renewed your mind to be more aware of who has you than how you'll get through this, you've built your life on a firm foundation. When you have an unrenewed mind, you're consumed by what you don't have. I call these if-only narratives. The disciples had them in this story, but you and I have them too. If only I was more outgoing, I'd have more friends. If only I had finished my university degree. If only I didn't have these health issues. If only I hadn't lost my job. If only I wasn't single. If only I wasn't married. Somebody needs to be honest in the room. If only I'd waited to have kids. If only I had a mentor. If only Alex Ferguson hadn't stepped down. Come on, the pain is real, guys. The pain is real. How do you know your mind is being renewed? Mind renewal has begun when you're more aware of who you're with than what you lack. See, the disciples' issue is not that they didn't have the intellectual ability or stamina to look around at 5,000 men plus women and children and figure out how to feed them. It's not that they lacked a theology degree. It isn't that they hadn't read enough Bible. It's not that they hadn't spent enough time in reciting their prayers. It's that they forgot who they were sitting with. And a renewed mind, the way you know your mind is starting to be renewed is you are more aware of who you're with than what you lack. What happens with our if-only narratives? You don't figure it out. It's not like you figure out a solution. You just remember, wait a second, I'm with someone who is not contained by my if-only. They're not limited by my if only. They didn't wake up this morning insecure about my if only. This morning, God woke up realizing all of the cosmos is sustained by my word. Not the word I released this morning, the word I released eons ago. My word is so powerful that it is still creating universes beyond our current universes. That's how powerful the word of God is. And when your mind has been renewed, you are aware that God is with me. I'm not bound by my own limitations. You see, we live in a world that is fascinated with being limitless. It's why the greatest movie franchise, the most well-attended movie franchise is about superheroes. We're fascinated with people who have no limits. The problem is we think faith means we don't have limits. Faith doesn't mean you and I don't have limits. It means we're connected to a God who has no limits. And we recognize that it is not his job to remove my limits. It is his job to be limitless despite my limits. That's faith. Faith is realizing that my limits don't limit God. Growth step number 2, the renewal of the mind. And growth step number 3, this is where it's all heading to. Are you ready? Say, I'm ready. Growth step number 3, go all in. Go all in. In our story with Jesus, multiplying food, I'm struck by the little boy's lunch. And you can see Andrew's mind is in the process of renewal by the fact that he even brings up the lunch. He overhears his dude Philip and the vibes emanating. And although he doesn't know how it could help, he knows that Jesus doesn't need much to work with. So he mentions the boy's lunch. Verse 9, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And just so I don't look dumb, but what are they for so many? The thing about having a faith that works, a faith that multiplies, is that when we're faced with a problem that we don't have nearly enough to solve, we tend to hold what we do have until we get all we need. But Andrew was already on the growth journey to a faith that works. He understood who he was with. His mind was being renewed to see from God's perspective. And he was about to exercise the final growth step in a faith that works. Go all in. Andrew was learning something that you and I can learn at Ramp Church. Jesus doesn't need much. He just needs all. Jesus can make anything out of nothing, but he won't make anything out of half. Jesus can make anything out of nothing, but he won't make anything out of half. If God decided to do something with half, he has some apologies to make. Let's start with Abraham, who offered his most prized possession to God. Or Noah, who bet everything he had on God in the face of social ridicule. What about Esther, who risked her very life to simply ask a question? Maybe Ezekiel, who has a prophetic gesture to Israel for how they'd fallen away from God, laid for 1.5 years on his side. Maybe Daniel, who as a Jew rose to the second most powerful person in a pagan empire and still refused to compromise even when it meant his life. Maybe ask Ananias and his wife Sapphira what God thinks about giving half. God would certainly owe them an apology. But one of my favorite all-in stories is Anna. Anna is spoken about briefly in Luke chapter 2, and she's praised because she had the prophetic foresight to recognize that Jesus, even though he was a baby at the time, was in fact the Jewish Messiah. Now, when you and I read through these few verses just very quickly, we don't understand the implication of this. But do you realize many people refused to accept Jesus' true identity when he was an adult? And he was going toe-to-toe with the most intellectual, most powerful class of his day and making an easy meal of them. This is aside from all the miracles that he performed. And yet they still did not choose to see who he really was. Anna identified Jesus as an infant. How do you gain that kind of prophetic foresight? Well, you see, Anna was already on the growth path to faith that works. She had been in God's presence enough to recognize this is the presence I've been in. I know it so well that even when it doesn't look the way I've seen it before, I know who this is. But this doesn't even still explain the miracle. Anna was married. We know enough about Anna to know this. She was married young, as most were in the ancient world. And when she was 21 years old, her husband died. We don't know of what. Now, in an agrarian society, this was a recipe for disaster for someone her age, because the means of making money generally involved physical labor. And men, of course, because of their physical advantages, were hired for that kind of work. So there was a social system set up where her family then would have taken care of her. But her family wasn't taking care of her. So either she didn't have a family or they'd rejected her. She was in a rough spot. But what the Bible says in Luke 2 is that in the middle of her own terrible story, living in the midst of a people group in a terrible story, the Jewish people in ancient Rome, Anna did this. Luke chapter 2, verses 36 through 38. There was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. 63 years. She did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up to that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. What did Anna do? She went all in. She recognized, I have limitations. I have some limitations some people could never fathom. How could my prayer and fasting life come to anything? Who am I? What do I have? Everything I have is being provided by an institution. It's the only way I can even eat. But I will give my entire life, not just my life, 60 plus decades to prayer and fasting. And then I'll be able to see the promise of Israel. And this is what I've realized about our limits, Ramp Church. The only limits that limit God are the limits we don't give him. How are we going to build a building? I don't know. I don't have enough. I mean, maybe you have £500,000 sitting in your bank account. If you do, come talk to me after church. If you don't, the worst thing you can do is discount what you do have because it's not enough to meet the need. Because God doesn't need much, but he does need all. So what you have may not be enough to meet the need, but if it's all God needs to meet the need. See, when you look at your own purpose, when you look at the mission field that God's called you to, and then when you look at your abilities or your experience or your intellect or your education or your connections, and you realize, I don't have what I need to meet this. Do you limit what you're believing God for based on what you don't have? No. All you've got to do is you've got to put everything that you are into his hands. Because once it's in his hands, he can do what he needs to reach a generation.